Well, good morning, good day, good whatever it is for you personally. I am not in charge of time zones. All time zones that I refer to from this point forward are Eastern Standard, and you can do the math yourself. That's the point where I'm at right now. We've got an auspicious group of guys gathered together to talk about the text of James. Terry will be introducing Marshall in just a second. He's been assigned that task. I'm going to mention Mike Walls and tell a bit of a story real quick. I've known Mike since we were about 5 years old. We grew up for quite a few years on the same street in Pleasanton, California. If anyone would ever complain about my preaching, my work in the kingdom, it's all Michael's fault. He's the one who invited me to a Bible study. He's the one who we rode to services together in motorcycles, fast cars, slow cars, sometimes walking. We've known each other a long time. And it's good to have him here for this Bible study. How you doing,
Thanks.
Mike?
I'm good. How are you? It's good to be here.
I'm a caged animal, needs to get out, but I can't. Uh, it's like a monkey inside of a minivan with no tire swing. That's pretty
Hey,
much me right now.
I got out and mowed my yard yesterday, and that's saying something for me. I hate doing that. That's
Yeah.
how desperate I am.
Terry, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm just going to apologize in advance that my dogs and my kids and even my wife seem to want to be on Do the Work today. So if they go passing behind me, just ignore the nonsense that is in the quarantine Francis clan house at this point. That's just
It's
where
pretty
we're
much
at.
normal.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we could have a father-in-law appearance at any moment too. Let's not forget that.
That's always entertaining.
As
Yes.
long as everyone knows what you're doing.
We just hope they have pants. So, Marshall joins us. Marshall Reed is a good friend of mine. I've known Marshall a long time. I don't think it's been since we were 5 years old, but we kind of known each other for quite a while. Marshall, I don't remember how long.
Well, if you went to camp at third grade, then that's when.
Yeah, well,
That's
I
pretty
think
close
that's
to
pretty
five.
close. Yeah. So Marshall is up at North Gardendale, which is just on the other side of Birmingham from me, and he joins us today. Marshall, good to have you. Thanks for being with us.
Glad to be here.
So let's go ahead and get to the heart of the matter. I'm sure there'll be plenty of time to make fun of each other and make obtuse references to something that none of us understand. But we're going to open up in the text of James and in chapter 4. And we're going to read verses, I think we're going to go ahead and continue at verse 5, even though we've explored the verse 5 at the close of our study on Friday, and read all the way through the 12th verse. And Mike, if you could read that for us in James chapter 4, verses 5 through 12.
Sure. Or do you suppose it is to no purpose that the scripture says he yearns jealously over the spirit that he has made to dwell in us? But he gives more grace. Therefore it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be wretched, and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning, and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. Do not speak evil against one another, brothers. The one who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks evil against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There's only one lawgiver and judge, he who is able to save and to destroy. But who are you to judge your neighbor?
So we've got a lot going on in the text. Thanks for reading that for us, Michael. But we are trying to make a couple of big picture connections. We talked about this when we began the text of James, that James as a letter is an expanded notes version of either the Sermon on the Mount or the broader teaching of Jesus. It has a lot of kingdom theology included in it. It has a lot of exposition of the ideas that Jesus would use to teach from, both pictorially, things about the sea, things about the general environment of the Galilean area, obviously relevant to James himself, but also matches Jesus' teaching. But then it has an immediate context that's really powerful in that you have Christians who have been established and sanctified into Christ in Jerusalem who are now being scattered abroad, sometimes referred to as the diaspora, but basically they're being pushed out for both theological reasons, God's warning them, practical reasons, they need to get out, it's dangerous. for them to stay there. And in the context of that, there is a maturation process that James is talking about through the entire book. That to be a man in Christ, a grown Christian, is a development of maturity through the processes of life. And so now, here in verses 6 and following, there's a slight language shift, but it still matches the broad themes from James 1, 2, 3, and then introductory 4 to now. So if you guys got some additional background stuff you want to bring in, there's 4 of us here today, so we get to practice the going around the horn business a little bit more often than normal. But what do you guys see here? I usually ask questions. Terry usually makes fun of me for asking questions. But let's go ahead and dig into verse 6. What are some first level observations, things you see in the text? Anybody? Bueller?
Well, I'll kick off with just this first phrase. He gives more grace. I think it's always interesting that if we're not careful, we reduce grace to a almost like a point in time kind of action. That grace is sometimes, if we're not careful, we look at it as a reboot for us personally, and then it's up to us to, because we were cleansed at baptism, that's kind of becomes our point in time for grace. That then it's up to us to kind of try to live perfectly from there on out again. And this idea of he gives more grace is an idea that it's more than just that kind of reboot of your life, that God's grace is deeper than that, and does more than just a once in time action. And I just think that's important to kind of see. And this idea of more or abundant grace is powerful to think about.
Yeah, I know for me, there's a thing to think about in that sometimes we are kind of trapped a bit by a dime store definition to the idea of grace. And if I were to ask a general Bible student over the years, what does grace mean? The immediate answer is, does everyone know the immediate answer?
Unmerited favor.
Everyone knows that. I will tell you that both from a linguistic sense and a understanding of the cultural use of grace in the New Testament, that's like the worst definition ever. And it's still stuck in the back of my head. It's not that it doesn't have a point there. There is a point to favor without merit. But the way that Paul uses grace, the way that even Jesus in a more Israelite context uses grace, is vastly different than simply favor without merit, because there's a level of community expectation for both the Israelite and the Gentile that's being demonstrated in grace on the practical level. And so the first thing that comes to mind when I think about verse 6 is he gives more grace, is also equivalent to the old Stan Lee comment that comes through Spider-Man. With this opportunity that's presented to yourself, you're going to have more responsibility. And I could ask you for the quote for the Spider-Man business. I think all of us could quote that one too, and I might later. But there's a parallel there, that when grace is extended to you, then grace on the outcome should be abundant.
The idea of grace in the ancient world, I mean, they understood that grace demanded a response, and when you have that honor shame culture and that grace, that the benefactors and the recipients, beneficiaries in that culture, to take what somebody has done for you and not do anything in return was majorly shameful. And James actually points that out here. What is our response to grace? Our response to grace should not be pride, it should be humility. And that humility will bring that relationship with the God that is giving you the grace. And unfortunately, man's problem from the very beginning, even in Genesis 3 with the sin in the garden, but especially exemplified in Genesis 11 with the Tower of Babel and going all through the Bible, is the problem of man's pride and rejecting God or not submitting to God, trying to elevate themselves rather than letting God do the elevating And James addresses all of that here in these verses.
And it's interesting. I would say this: when you really understand God's grace and what all that involves, I don't know how you can help from being humble. Truly, when you really understand it, I mean, God's grace involves, like I said, more than just this one time. But I look at 1 Corinthians 10:13, this promise of escape. God's always going to provide a way of escape. That's part of His grace that He gives to us, that He extends to us. And I think one of the things that comes from really understanding grace is just how dependent we are on God for our spiritual lives, for every part of this. So from that standpoint, I just think it's interesting to kind of think along those lines and realize that should cause me to be more humble in my response. And not just because that's what I owe God, but because that is the only obvious response when you fully understand grace. Is to give humility and submission, as it says here.
And unfortunately, even in the religious world today, people who claim to be Christians, they think that grace gives them liberty and freedom, and they cheapen it. Unfortunately, I don't think serious Bible students do that, even amongst those in the denominations. I think that those who really understand the concept of grace, no matter what their background, will get that. But too many of the casual Christians today, they think of grace as just a get out of jail free card. And that's just not the case. I mean, it should cause us to really want to serve Him with every fiber of our being. And, so humility is the only proper response, the only one. And we accept that in our normal life and our interaction with people. If we are showing grace to somebody and they don't respond in a certain way, what do we call them? Ungrateful. And we recognize that's just not the proper response.
I was thinking this is like a parental child relationship, right? And that's again the picture that we have of God with us. And I was reading, I'm still kind of back in verse 5. I know you guys talked about it last time, right? This idea of jealousy. And I was kind of looking it up. It's always showing up in the case of idolatry when it says God is a jealous God, for example. And then I read about Hosea. You go, all this connection you guys kind of hit on last time with the adultery versus the idolatry. And so how many times does God say, you guys messed up, and maybe brings down punishment, but then He's still there and He's just waiting for them to respond, waiting for them to come back, exactly like a parent should do. And then the response should be this humble return. I guess we could say like the prodigal son, right? This humble return, this humility, which of course James is getting to, but the parent's always there. The parent's always loving. The parent's giving more grace to their child, knowing that their child's imperfect but still expecting them to do better. So there's that response.
Yeah. So I'll add this, and before we kind of scooch into a little bit more, is to think about one more interaction of grace on a personal level. A lot of times we look at the life of David and we emphasize a couple of key events. We talk about his spiritual rebellion with Bathsheba and the awful interlude there. We talk about how God sees him later down the road as a person after His own heart. And then we forget that the David of the Old Testament is an absolute mess. From his youthful side, he's elevated to the top of the world. And everyone, like if you take an 18-year-old kid and tell him, you the man, and have the entire nation cheer for him, that's like ego-central for even some of the best kids. And then
we used to see that when we could watch sports on TV, right?
Yeah, high-level entitlement. And then right after that, he goes to live with a king who's literally insane, tries to kill him, and he behaves like him down the road. He acts insane. He goes and gets Goliath's sword, essentially lies to get that, gets his own little posse together, does all kinds of horribly stupid things in the building of the whole story of who he is. And then the strong David that we find that sins with Bathsheba still isn't the full picture. And God uses a guy like that because He reaches a point of humility and provides to him not only sufficient grace for his strengthening, but to be a strength to others too. And I think there's something here in James that's helping us understand that also ties together another biblical story, which is Job, which we'll talk about more, particularly as we get to verse 7, at least from my perspective. But let's kind of move in there a little bit, I guess, into verse 7. We might talk about humility in a moment and kind of what that goes along there. But verse 7, it reads, "Submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you." It's another one of those highly simplified texts that get play as like badges on T-shirts and bags and signage on walls in people's houses. But have we thought about the two levels that at least I see? There's an earthly level where the devil is pictured as his servants, and that's usually us or people who are in the world. But there's also the heavenly realm that I think is or the unseen realm side of things is really powerful too, where the devil's still doing his bit. And I think that's where Job comes into play. That interaction between the devil, Job, Jehovah, Job, and all the people around it is not just a one-time thing. I've tried to learn to perceive it as, have you considered my servant Philip? And then how does God interact with that dialogue when the devil's part of the game too? What do you guys see there? What do you bring into to your own experiences and studies?
There's a lot here, man. I wrote down a whole bunch of stuff, but I was looking at kind of the end of verse 6, beginning of verse 7, where it says, "God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Then resist the devil, and he will flee from you." But think about the opposite of that, right? If you resist God, he will destroy you ultimately. And then if you go down to the end of this paragraph in verse 10, "Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you." So there's the opposite. But what happens if you humble yourself before the devil? He will destroy you, right?
Yeah.
And so,
for sure,
when you step back and you go, "Whoa, there's not really a choice here. So why are we being so foolish and stubborn and adulterous," to use James's language here, is beyond reason.
Yeah.
When you brought up Job, one of the things about Job that always amazes me is that we're given this story, the backstory of Job, and what's amazing is Job goes through his actual story without knowing that backstory. Like Job never fully understands what happens in Job 1 and 2 like we do. But that glimpse into the kind of the interactions of the spiritual realm there in a narrative form really puts into kind of terms we can manage, at least in our minds. And I think that's one of the things that's so hard to understand is sometimes, when you get into the spiritual realm, there's just limitations I have to be able to understand all of that. But God does a good job of putting those in at least descriptions or manageable terms for me to somewhat come to grasp with and understand. And so from that standpoint, you have that going on there in Job. Well, I think one of the things you see in verse 7, to kind of build on what Michael said, is, if the first part of verse 7 was there, then the second phrase would be impossible. Like if the instructions of James were just resist the devil, he will flee from you, that's not possible. I mean, this is somewhat order dependent in verse 7. Before I can resist the devil, I have to submit myself to God. Like that's the only way that then I can resist the devil. And I do think, by the way, that goes along with grace, that part of the grace that God extends to me, like I said, is at 1 Corinthians 10:13, providing me the way of escape so that I can resist the devil. So I have to submit to God first for this to even be a possibility. And I think one of our problems is sometimes we try to resist the devil before we really submit to God. And we struggle with that because we think it's our job to do that by ourselves. And ultimately, if you try to do this on your own, if you just try to shear up and cowboy up with your own willpower and try to manage sin and temptation by yourself without God, that's just not possible. And I just think that's one of the things that really stands out to me here is that idea in verse 7 of the need to submit myself to God first, fully submit myself to him, and then I can resist the devil. And it's not because of me, it's because I've submitted to God and I'm following God that the resistance is even possible.
Yeah.
And let me piggyback on that and echo Terry's comments about the grace of God there. God demands quite a bit from us. But part of God's grace is making it possible for us to do what he demands. And what he goes on to say here in these verses is not impossible for people to do. We sometimes wonder, well, how can we stop? And I just can't seem to stop this particular sin that I'm struggling with. It's just too much ingrained in me. I can't do it. I'm helpless. Well, like Terry said, yeah, on our own we are. We have to rely on God's grace, and that's not just the relying upon the grace is going to forgive us of our sins. While that's certainly true,
Right.
it's the grace that also gives us the power to overcome that. And he gives us the formula here in these 3 verses, 7, 8, 9, of exactly how to do that. And it reminds me also of Ephesians chapter 6, where Paul is talking about the armor of God. And in verse 10, a verse that's always struck me is finally be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Where's our strength come from? The Lord. It's his power. It's his might. It's not ours. We put on the whole armor of God, not our own armor. So to use Terry's words, we can't just cowboy up, man up. It's not in us. We cannot defeat it ourselves. And so we have to admit that. We have to be humble and show our spiritual poverty and turn to God for that grace, not only the grace of forgiveness, but the grace of the power to overcome that. And of course, the next verse forms the opposite in this couplet. Number 1, you flee the devil, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. And well, it doesn't just stop there. You got to draw near to God.
We have of course, I'm at Fort Hood, right? So we have all these Army guys and girls. And one of the things I always say is you always default to your training. When something happens, when there's stress, when there's an event, you default to your training. And I was thinking exactly the same thing. Ephesians 6, in the Romans, right? The Roman army's strength was not on the individual. It was on the army. It was on the training. It was on, just like Paul says, the weapons and everything that's provided. And you have to submit to that process. You have to submit to their training, just like the military today, just like we do. And then it works. This other stuff, as you said, cowboying up, doesn't work.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of expand the picture a little bit. When we began, we talked about some misunderstandings of grace and how our own personal ignorance was present in the way that we were educated, instructed. We kind of all knew that basic level definition. And it's only recently for me, and maybe for y'all, to have a more holistic view of what grace can look like in the big sense. And most of that comes from other believers who are all over the board in their understanding of Bible authority, spiritual background. And a lot of folks may have already been at the table that we've just joined up to. And so I think that's something that's really important that also James is trying to get us to understand in the bigger picture of James, because it ties together 2 great pictures that James has already taught. Picture number 1, these wealthy Jewish Christians are going to be cared for by the poor exiles, either exiles from Jerusalem who are now in Christ or exiles who are Gentiles who thought they were exiled from God. And so they're going to the table of feasting from that they were in the middle of their famine spiritually. But there's one more thing that I think is textual there that's really important, because there's a picture that James is starting to draw here that ties to the teaching of Jesus. Most of us are familiar with 2 interludes or pericopes with Jesus where he's talking to the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, and he talks about one of 2 things. Either their ritualistic purification practice. You got to wash your hands. If you're not familiar with washing your hands right now, everyone knows the 30-second songs, right? We've got all that down. Like, we're really good with that. That'll probably be the new parable illustration for the next 30 years. But the other one is the whitewashed tomb statement. Clean on the outside, but dead men bones on the inside. Presently, if you surround walk around the Temple Mount zone, it is surrounded by graves. A lot of that was presented during the various Ottoman occupations and the shift in power structures in Jerusalem. But basically 3 sides of the Temple Mount are graveyards full of dead men's bones of all kinds of folks. There are some Christian graveyards, there are Jewish graveyards. Most of the graveyards up close to the Temple Mount are all Islamic era additions to defile the ground and to keep the Jews away from the temple. And then you go back to this statement that kind of ties this all together. Verse 8, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and here's the key, purify your hearts. Just like Jesus did, he drove from the outside to the inside in those teaching moments, cleansing your hands, cleansing the tomb, to the inside. Purify your heart. I think of all of the things that are in the context here immediately, a pure heart is what's being desired by God. And it comes through in all kinds of splendid ways, but right here, he's just dropped the 10-pound bomb on you and said, we'll carry this weight. Now it's 1,000 pounds. Now it's 10,000 pounds. Can you carry it on your own? No, you need me to help. But you're going to have to purify your heart if you want to lift it. There's a lot going on there, and I just thought it would be really valuable to kind of bring in that picture again.
By the way, the first part of verse 8, when it talks about draw near to God, he will draw near to you, I can't help but think about the parable of the lost son or the prodigal son. Mm-hmm. That when he finally comes home, the father doesn't wait for him to come all the way home. He goes and meets him. And I think that's one of the things, too, that we have to understand is that God is waiting for us to come near him, to head towards him, but he doesn't necessarily in these pictures, the Bible doesn't paint a picture of a stern God who waits for you to get all the way to the throne before he responds. And that's to go back to what Michael talked about earlier, the parenting image. It's a comforting image of a loving father that wants to draw near to his child, that wants that relationship. And all of us would understand that if our children had left and were gone, we would be the same way. And God is the same way. And then when you get to, what you just talked about, the end of verse 8, this idea, I think also, besides to purify your hearts, and what he's really getting at is that last statement, you double-minded. I mean, the real problem here obviously is these people are trying to kind of play both sides of the fence. They're still having their fleshly life on one side and trying to also be a disciple on the other side. And part of this is, and I think we've all been there before, and sometimes and this is a continual struggle at times. Sometimes, it's not about cowboying up, as we've said, but you do have to decide what you want to be. Like, you do have to make a decision if you're going to be a disciple or not. And that's necessary. And I think we struggle with that sometimes, that that flesh versus spirit struggle still there. And you gotta decide to be focused on either this life and the devil, or be focused on God and the life to come. And I just think that's an important part to be pointed out too, this double-mindedness that's presented.
Well, why is it, do you think, that when the Apostle Paul, of all people, is writing about that and saying, hey, I'm struggling with this stuff, we all think, hey, when I become a Christian or when I get older, all that somehow magically goes away. It doesn't, right?
Yeah.
And this double-minded bit is something that James has talked about quite a bit throughout his letter. He started in the first chapter when talking about praying for wisdom or praying for anything, and if you doubt, you're not going to get it because that man is double-minded. He talks about the man that looks in the mirror and sees his condition and walks away. Well, that's a double-minded man. You got the way that speech is used in chapter 3, and that's a double tongue, a forked tongue, to use the Native American terminology. And then here you got this friendship with the world, and that's enmity with God. That's being double-minded. That's having trying to focus on two different things. And whenever I read these verses, I don't know why, but I never can seem to get away from this connection. But it always makes me think of a song by Van Halen. Not that Van Halen.
You got a perfect audience for this.
Ever spiritually minded by any stretch of the
perfect
imagination.
Audience right here. Let's go. Roll it.
We have to ask which version.
This is the Van Hagar. Excuse me.
Van Hagar. Okay.
Van Hagar.
Okay. Yes. Noted.
A song that maybe y'all are familiar with, Best of Both Worlds.
Mm-hmm.
And this perfectly sums up the kind of attitude that so many people have, and unfortunately, even us Christians. And here's one of the things that one of the parts of the lyrics is, I want the best of both worlds. Baby, I know what it's worth. We can have the best of both worlds, a little heaven right here on earth. He goes on to say, you don't have to die to go to heaven or hang around to be born again. Just tune in to what this place has got to offer, because we may never be here again.
Yeah.
That's a double-minded man.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And it's you can expand it to almost every musical genre has pieces just like that. Country's got it, rap's got it. Disco probably had it. My disco skills are a little limited these days, but I guarantee you it's across the spectrum because it's a human thing.
Yeah.
We want all the things without any of the responsibility. We want all the blessings without any of the curses. None of this is new. So we're at,
By the way,
go ahead.
I just want to say that Gary Sharon is one of the most underrated Van Halen members you all but to move on, verse 9, be wretched and mourn and weep. I think that's also to tie back to the purify hearts, the brokenheartedness, and I agree. Phil has said over and over again, described they're being displaced, they're leaving their, things behind, leaving their way of making a living, all kinds of things are being scattered. And I think that plays into the double-mindedness, right? I mean, it's this struggle of, and by the way, I think to use a common version today, I think sometimes, I think with what we're dealing with now, that there's some double-mindedness, right? To illustrate that. In one sense, if we're not careful, we focus on the economy and the potential loss of financial gain, and that worries us. And so then there's a point of that where we're like, well, we just can't do this for long. On the other side, it's like, well, if we don't do this for long, then too many people are going to die. And so that's worth it. And so there's that conflict there. And I think for them, it's that conflict of the financial loss versus the scattering and all of that. And yet one of the things I think is interesting there is this idea of the response of purifying your hearts and humility ends in weeping and mourning over your double-mindedness. And I think that's interesting, that idea here, and that plays a role. I wonder when the last time we actually mourned or wept over our struggle spiritually. When was the last time that you wept about that?
Yeah. So we got an excellent question I want to add to this, Terry, and I think it ties in specifically with your comment. Jason asks,
211, is that the comment you're talking about?
No.
Okay.
Jason asks from one of the feeds somewhere, I've talked with 2 more Christians who struggle with getting back aligned with God after sinning. And his question is, does sinning make us double-minded, or is it more lifestyle, or both? And because we're getting close to the capstone of our time, we're going to go around the horn with perspectives of answers. So, Terry, you were already talking, so you can get a break to think. Marshall, you're up. What's your initial answer to that question? If you want to read it again, I can.
Yes, please read the question again.
So I've talked to more Christians who struggle with getting back aligned with God after sinning. The question, does sinning make us double-minded, or is it more lifestyle, or both?
Does sinning make us double-minded, or is it more lifestyle, or both? I'm actually going to go a different direction with this. I'm going to say that the sinning, and the lifestyle is a product of the double-mindedness. That if you don't get the mind right first, if you don't get focused on God, and then that's the contrast that James points out here is the devil versus God. Who are you going to draw close to? And the more you're drawing close to God, if you are in the Word, if you are building that relationship with God, if you are spending that time in prayer, if you're spending that time in study and in meditation, doesn't mean you're going to be sinless, but it's certainly going to mean that your mindset is completely different. Your focus is different. And you are going to be more single-minded than you are double-minded. And so therefore, the lifestyle will be a product of where your focus is and what your mind is on. And if it's on spiritual matters, then the sinfulness and the lifestyle is not going to be there. and or at least not in abundance. And so I would say that the practice of sin or the lifestyle would be a product of being double-minded.
Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more than that. I was thinking of Romans 6, where Paul's talking about who are we presenting ourselves to as slaves, which side, right? Again, two sides. So to try to argue that somehow we're going to be sinless, of course, is foolishness, and we can't do that. But it's clear that the scripture warns us about sinful lifestyle. So maybe the point of the question, or the spirit of that question, was kind of in those veins. Is the person who does sin somehow double-minded? The answer is not necessarily.
Right.
And I think that's what you're saying, right, Marshall?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Terry?
Yeah, so I think the double-mindedness is just a matter of, as all said, the heart. I mean, Jesus said it's what comes out of the heart defiles a man, right? So in that sense, the sin or the lifestyle, either one, is more of a manifestation for some of their double-mindedness. And the double-mindedness is a heart problem. That's the causation behind those things. But, when we sin, that doesn't necessarily mean we're being double-minded. And I think that's kind of the thought that everybody's presented there. Let me say this. I think one of the things when you talk about submitting to God here, and what that really looks like for somebody who is struggling with sin, and what that really means about cleansing your hands, purifying your hearts, wretched and mourn and weep. When you talk about people that struggle with a sinful lifestyle, and whether that's sexual addiction, alcohol, any form of chemical addiction, maybe they're a habitual liar, any of those kind of things, those would be the sinful lifestyle that perhaps the double-mindedness led to. By the way, I would submit Judas as a perfect example of double-mindedness that resulted in sin.
Yeah.
Of this conflict between being a disciple, and he was a disciple, don't discredit that, and his struggle with greed and covetousness that ultimately over time led him to betray the Lord. And so I think one of the things to keep in mind is that part of submitting to God in that is not just saying that you love God and not just trying to go to God, but following the ways that God solves that problem, the escapes. One of those escapes, by the way, and just because that's a whole nother show, right? But let me just give you one of those escapes that's so hard for all those people: changing your relationships. If you're struggling with alcohol, then you have to cut off the relationships that enable the alcohol. And that's part of what submitting to God and resisting the devil in this text looks like in a practical sense. So to ultimately answer the question, when somebody comes face to face with that, that's where their double-mindedness is revealed, and it's not necessarily a sin, but it comes down to, do I want to not sin and lose these friendships, or do I want to continue in these friendships and act like I'm not going to sin if I am? Yeah. And so I think that's kind of a good way to kind of think about that in just one small area or illustration of that. So it's more of a heart issue than a sin or a lifestyle issue in that sense.
Can I make one other just quick comment?
Sure.
We've all said that, the Christian that is trying to do what's right and is certainly focused on drawing near to God is still going to sin from time to time, and that doesn't make him double-minded. And I would certainly agree with that. However, I would say that at least at that moment, we are being double-minded. In any sin, it doesn't matter what it is, you fill in the blank, that is basically a lack of humility, that lack of subjection. Is a focus on self, focus on the worldly things. And so even if it is just for a moment, then we are being double-minded. And yet the great thing about God and his grace that Terry was pointing out about the prodigal son and the father is he is obviously going to welcome him back, but he never holds that sin over his son's head. And he ends up exalting him, which of course James goes on to talk about here. is the son humbled himself. And what did the father do? He didn't braid him. He didn't hold it over him. He exalted him. And so he realized, yeah, for a while you were double-minded, but you're back in the fold now.
So I'll kind of sum things up real quick, and then we'll have a few moments for each of you to say adios and whatever you need to as we close out. There's 4 of us again. But since we've already had the notable act of Van Halen with Eddie Van Halen and his crew, I will cite the well-known poet of our age, Jay-Z, where he says, "Get your mind right, mammy." And I think that's part of the answer to Jason's question. If you think about it, maybe simplified in this way. Going back to a contextual reference in James, and you have Rahab. What was she willing to do because of how much she recognized the power and sanctity of God from one aspect of whom they were? She knew that the nations melted before Israel. She was then willing to forsake all that was normal to her for the sanctity of her family and herself. And she literally converted to Israel at that point. You move forward to us today, and when we think about what a double-minded man looks like, the level of our commitment rises in the process of our transformation, and we become more and more willing to cut off our right hand in order to see eternity, to take out our eye in order to see heaven. I think part of the picture of the double-mindedness comes in a proper perspective that's like that. What am I willing to do because of the King? You look at Terry's reference to Judas. He had seen the power of Jesus get so many out of bad circumstances, and he believed and knew what God could do, even to the point where he's willing to sell Jesus. And I look at that instance, and I think Terry does too, where Judas is going, oh, he'll get himself out of this one too. There's no risk here. Yeah. The reward is great. And then everything shifted. So when Jason Schoenholz mentions perhaps the reason for more grace, I think it really is part of that too, because in our maturation process, we deepen our commitment to be willing to do more than we used to because we see more of whom God is. And there's a lot of richness there. And then we get like Paul, and that's where James also ties his own personal perspective, is because James, like Paul, was one who either spurned or abandoned Jesus. He says, be wretched, mourn, and weep. That's literally the Paul we see in the New Testament whenever he looks back to the Saul we first met. So that's my broad answer to Jason's question. It kind of ties in to everyone's there. I first want to thank everyone for being with us today for this study. And we'll go top to bottom as it appears on the screen. Michael, do you have any last comments you want to make before we shut out the feed for today?
I just want to thank y'all for inviting me. It's been a great study. Good to meet some of you. Yeah. I've known Phil for, I don't want to say exactly how many years. Let's just say since we were 5. And the rest of you I'm just meeting now. So it's great to be here. Keep up the good work.
Terry?
Hey, good to meet Michael, and maybe later we should exchange phone numbers so I can get some of those stories to blackmail.
For sure.
With. Yeah, I think Michael's Cash App is available to all.
Okay, we'll put that in the comments and notes section. His Cash App contact info, and but it's good to meet him, and always good to see Marshall. We're about 40 minutes away, but of course we can't be together right now under any circumstances. So Marshall, keep holding things down on the north side of town, and we'll keep working on the south side of town.
There you go.
And hopefully see you soon.
Marshall?
Yeah, thank you for the invite. Certainly a profitable discussion. I think that it's these verses in James. I mean, I love the book of James as a whole, but these verses in James are particularly strong, maybe even the strongest section of the book of James, and calls us to do some very drastic things in our life and challenging things that we all need. And I wanted to say a while ago, never did, but I'll say it now in the closing remarks, that I really appreciated Terry's comment about the mourning and weeping and when's the last time we did that. I think this is a verse and an attitude that we miss in our Christian life quite a bit. Yeah. That we do not, unfortunately, act like David did in Psalm 51 and his repentance. And we need more of that. We need more of that. And so these verses are calling us to do some really, really hard things. We need these verses. We need the encouragement from James, and we need for him to call us adulterers and adulteresses. We need for him to call us out and tell us just how it really is.
Yeah. Terry, when's our next broadcast?
Tomorrow at 10 o'clock Central Time, 11 o'clock Eastern Time.
Yeah. That's for accuracy. All my time references, just so everyone knows, if I say a time, I intend it to be Eastern Time, but Terry is in charge of accurate time statements for this broadcast.
I don't see why you're leaving out the Westerners, but hey.
Well, they're still in bed.
You're in Central Time, Mike.
I know I am, but
yeah.
Well, we can't figure out those, like Arizona doesn't do daylight save. That's all confusing. Why? I mean, no, just, I will say though, I think tomorrow tentative schedule, and correct me if I'm wrong, Phil, is potentially our two guests are Shane Scott and Steve Wolfgang.
That's correct.
Works out, and look forward to a great discussion tomorrow.
Yeah, Terry and I are going to mute ourselves for that entire discussion, I think, at that point, and just chill out.
turn them on.
Yeah, just chill out.
Yeah. Talking about being around intellectual giants tomorrow.
Well, thank you.
Well, giants.
Thank you for that.
Right, I know. Michael, I think we can just sign off right now.
Yeah. I'm out. Hey, again, everyone, thank you very much for being part of the study today. Thank you for your comments, your questions, both public and private. We want to encourage you to live righteously and seek heaven. And as we've been saying in the course of this study, we want you to know that our desire and hope for you is that God would bless you. Take care, all.